Hello and welcome, my name is Racho and today we will be covering Caliban's new rework. So before we get into explaining what the rework is, let's give some background information into Caliban. So Caliban was often the forgotten Warframe, and ever since Anaros' rework, he's often been considered the worst Warframe in the game. This isn't true. Caliban pre-rework wasn't a good Warframe, don't get me wrong, but he wasn't a bad Warframe. He was thoroughly average. He had something very powerful going for him, which was his fourth ability, and then his other abilities were a bit just mediocre, didn't make anything shine about him. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad they reworked him because he is a much better Warframe now. But I think the issue with Caliban was the way he was gotten as a frame, as you get him from Nama bounties, and on top of that you need to have anomaly shards, which are gotten from long, annoying railjack missions. So it can be a bit annoying to farm, so a lot of people wouldn't really take the effort to farm a Warframe when they're really not that special. And because not a lot of people had him, he was often forgot about, which led to the assumption that it was the worst frame in the game. But yeah, so now he has a rework and he is much better. He hasn't gone from anything super crazy. Again, he wasn't that bad to begin with, and now he's nothing amazingly strong, but he's definitely a much better Warframe. He didn't do a Hydroid where he went from literally absolutely garbage to one of the best frames in the game. He went from a very, very thoroughly mediocre frame to a pretty good frame. So nothing super crazy, but definitely much better. Anyway, let's get into it. So to begin with, Caliban is the sentient Warframe. His lore is he was actually made by the sentients while the new war was happening. Or sometime around about that, but he was made by the sentients. Because of this, he now has the Tau damage type. This is a damage type that's been in the game for a very long time, but we as players have never been able to use it because it is the damage type of sentients. Only sentients have been able to use it. Previously, Caliban's abilities did a mix of different damage types like Blast, Slash, all that kind of stuff. But with his rework, all of his abilities will now do Tau, which makes a lot of sense because he is a sentient himself. This means that Caliban is the only Warframe in the entire game that can do Tau, and you can only do Tau damage while playing Caliban. Originally, the Tau damage type didn't have a status effect associated with it, but with Caliban's new rework, so he does the Tau damage, there is also now a new Tau status effect, which Caliban can make use of. What this status effect does is it will give a status chance buff, or debuff I guess, on enemies. Meaning, when you shoot an enemy, your status chance will be increased depending on the amount of Tau status effects on the enemy. It caps out at 10 procs, and at 10 procs it will give you 100% status chance. And this is an absolute status chance buff, so if you have a weapon that has a modded 50% status chance, it will go to 150%. This works very similarly to the way Dante's fourth ability works with his birds. So his passive is basically a weaker version of adaptation. So if you don't know what adaptation is, when you take damage from an enemy, you will gain a damage reduction to a specific damage type, up to 90%. His passive works the same way. When you take a damage from an enemy, you will build up a damage reduction to one of the damage types it's dealing, whatever the most one is, up to 50%. So it is weaker than adaptation. It is applied to all allies with an affinity range, which is nice. However, the issue of this ability, unless I missed somewhere in the patch notes and it has been changed, I don't think it has. The issue with the passive is it doesn't stack with adaptation. If you have adaptation, or if any of the allies have adaptation, this passive will be completely override, so you'll only get the 90% DR from adaptation, not 95% from adaptation and Caliban's passive, as an example. His passive has been unchanged with his rework. With his rework, I will be explaining how the abilities work now, and then after I do that, I'll explain how they're different from what they used to be. I'm doing this way because I don't think a lot of people even know how Caliban's kit worked to begin with. So Caliban's first ability, Caliban will be propelled forward at quite fast speeds while spinning around, dealing Tau damage to enemies while also inflicting the Tau status effect. The ability doesn't do much damage, but it's more of a utility ability, as you will be healed for each enemy you hit with this ability. And if you have max health, instead of gaining health, you'll get shields, which will then go into overshield. So it can be a very, very good way of actually gaining shields. Additionally, you will actually gain energy, 25% of the energy you spent on the ability for each enemy you hit. This is similar to the way Nidus' first ability works. And because of this, if you are hitting a lot of enemies with this ability, you can actually like top off your energy very quickly with this ability. It works very well like an energy factory. So how has this ability changed? Well, obviously it never used to do tower damage. The ability didn't used to regen shields either. It did heal you, but it didn't go into shields if you had max health. The ability was a lot slower when to casting it, and it also didn't give you the energy regen. So basically didn't do anything. It just like made you weak as you like ran around dealing very little damage to enemies with some health, but like you were locked in from doing any of your other abilities. Now it's like a very quick, you launch forward kind of movement ability, making it a lot better. Caliban's second ability will have him stomp his foot on the ground. That will send out a shockwave and a full 360 around him. Enemies hit by the shockwave will be lifted up into the air, and they will receive tower damage with a guaranteed tower status effect. And the enemies that are lifted will also take increased damage by 35%, obviously scaling up power strength, from all the sources of damage. The way this ability has been changed is the ability is now a lot faster to cast than it used to be. Enemies will no longer move when they're lifted up in the air. They used to float around and kind of like fly all over the place. And there also used to be a enemy cap. There used to be a limit to how many enemies you could hit with this ability. Now there's no cap. And lastly, when you would hit an enemy with this ability, like after casting the ability, if you would hit an enemy that was lifted with one of your weapons, they would fall back to the ground. The effect would stop working on them. Now they stay lifted for the entire duration of the ability. And obviously it also does tower damage, which it never used to do before. This is Caliban's Helminth ability, and the Helminth version actually has had a nerf. It has an alteration that it never used to have. It doesn't do tower damage or tower status as the Helminth ability. Actually, I think it still does tower damage, but not tower status, which is very upsetting. I was hoping to play around with that, see if I could get some fun builds with that. And it also only activates in a comb in front of him. It doesn't have the full 360 effect. So they actually nerfed the ability a lot as a Helminth. I don't really know why they did it, because it wasn't really a good Helminth to begin with anyway, but hey, whatever. Caliban's second ability will summon one of 3 different types of sentient groups. And by one, I mean only one of the types. It actually summons multiple sentients depending on which one we're talking about. The sentients, while active, will give you shield regen, and I think they also give allies shield regen. At least one of them definitely does. And they have additional effects depending on which one you are using. The melee variant of the sentients will supposedly do the most damage of them, but none of the sentients do a lot of damage, so I wouldn't rely on that anyway. What they do, however, is mimic your 4th ability, which can be very fun to play around with. And casting this ability will summon 3 of them in one go. The second version is the ranged ones. They will obviously attack enemies from a range, and the difference that they have is they have a 100% status chance on all of their attacks, and they do only tower damage, meaning they will be applying tower on every single one of their attacks. And they also have this mortar attack where they kind of like fire off multiple attacks up in the air and like that lands on enemies. And that attack actually has a 300% status chance. So they're very good with applying the tower status effect very quickly over a large field of enemies. And then the last one is a portal sentient. Oh, sorry, the ranged ones you also summon 3 with one cast. The portal sentient you will only summon one of, but what the portal sentient does is actually spawns 6 other sentients, so 7 in total. That will then go around and attacking enemies and like kind of crowd controlling them, as enemies will go and attack them instead. Since the portal sentient summons the most amount of sentients, as it summons 7 instead of 3 like the other 2, it will give you the most shield regen out of any of the 3. And this one, at the very least, does give shield regen to allies as well. I don't know about the other 2. How did this effect ability get changed? Well, a lot actually. This is probably the ability that got changed the most. Before, the way it worked is you would only summon 1 sentient per cast, and you would have a maximum of 3 sentients. And there was only one type of sentient, so you didn't get to choose between 3 different types. It was only the melee version of it, and you would have to summon 3 of them individually. You'd have to cast the ability 3 times to summon the maximum amount you can get from it. The ability also did not mimic your 4th ability. So it was literally just shield regen, you would summon sentience, you'd have to activate the ability 3 times to get the most amount of them, and it didn't mimic your 4th ability. So big improvement here with this ability, because now we have 3 different types of sentience. We summon 3 of them with 1 cast, or 7 in the case of the portal one. And they have some additional effects related to them as well. So much better ability now. Finally, Caliban's 4th ability will summon 3 beams, one that like comes out of his chest and another 2, one each from one of his hands, that he will kind of collide in the middle as he brings his hands together. Enemies that get hit by the beam will be receiving tower damage with a 20% status chance, and the beam can do multiple instances of damage. And they will also be defense stripped by 50%, that does scale of power strength. So the beam's hits will defense strip, that's both shields and armor. After the beams collide, a small explosion will occur on every enemy that was tagged by the ability. So every single one of them will cause a small 2-meter explosion that does scale of range. And another explosion will also be caused centered at where the actual beams met at the end. And lastly, after the ability, this big field or aura radius will be summoned centered around where the beams met in the middle. And enemies that are within that field will also have their defenses stripped by 50% against scaling of power strength. And these strips, both from the beams and also this big field, are permanent strips. So if a new enemy walks into this field, they will have their armor and shields permanently stripped, even if they leave the field again. It's not like Zaku's ability, where if they leave it, they get their defenses back. If they enter it, their armor is gone forever. How did this ability change? Not that much. Basically, the ability worked the same, however, it was slower to cast, so the casting speed was improved again, like the second ability. It obviously now does tower damage, it never used to do that, it used to do blast damage. Enemies never used to explode when they were tagged by the ability. The beams itself never used to defense strip enemies, only the actual field after the ability defense strip enemies. And that's basically the big difference. So now the beams defense strip enemies as well, and also enemies tagged by the ability will cause that little explosion dealing tower damage as well. So before we get into the build that I'm going to show off primarily within this video, I do want to talk about the idea of making Caliban a DPS Warframe right now. I did have a build that I made for him that does kind of make him a DPS Warframe, and I took it into survival and it was working. However, the KPM is quite low, so it doesn't work very well. I was going to show this video build off in addition to the other build that I'm going to pay more attention to, but because the KPM being low and it's not really at the point that I would like it to be, I'm not going to show off the build in detail, but I will show you how it works. I'll kind of run you through how it works, and I also will show you the build on Caliban. But I won't go into detail about it. But basically the way it works, so it's an ability DPS setup using his 4th ability. You summon the melee version of the sentience, and then we do have Raw as well, obviously to increase the damage of our 4th ability. And then you simply just use the 4th ability to attack enemies. As you can see, it doesn't really do the most damage. These enemies are obviously very tanky. And if we were to use it against weaker enemies, we'd be able to kill them a lot more effectively. And I'll show you that happening as well. So here we have some weaker enemies. So we'll cast our 3rd again, get those up and going. And we'll see here that it does decent damage to enemies. Like it nuked all these enemies, right? Well, most of them at least. It does suffer from pretty bad line of sight checks. And it doesn't do a lot of damage to hard enemies. And it's weak against Overguard as well, which is why you definitely want to pair this with a magnetic primer to be able to shoot through the Overguard. But yeah, it's definitely a setup you can do. It's just not a very good setup compared to other Warframes. So it has a low KPM. But yeah, the build is pretty simple. I obviously used Raw. I replaced it over his 2nd ability because I will be using the 1st as like an energy factory on it. And then we just have like a basic setup. Equilibrium from energy, obviously, adaptation, prime flow, and then I just kind of went all in on strength, a bit of duration and a bit of efficiency as well. Yeah, I went all in on strength, line rage, Augment Transify, secrets, and augmented. So you wanted as much strength as possible to kind of rip through the enemies, but yeah, not the best setup. I do pair this setup with Nautilus for grouping with Cordon, which does make it better because the explosions triggered on enemies will obviously every enemy that are grouped together will be hit by that. And I'll show you off what that looks like, how effective it is with the grouped enemies, back again with the heavy gunners. So here's the heavy gunners, right? The setup wasn't enough to kill the heavy gunners before, but if we grouped them together, it should do a good bit more damage. Yeah, see, it still doesn't really do that much damage against heavier, like tankier enemies like this. So yeah, again, definitely something to think about. Definitely fun to play around with. I had fun using the build, but like, it's not at a standard that I would like to actually like make the whole video about it. But I still wanted to mention it anyway as like a possibility that you could make a build for. What the build I'm showcasing actually does though is capitalize on Caliban's 4th ability, as it is a very unique ability in the sense that you have this massive field it can make that will just defend strip enemies, and it will remain on the field for quite a while. So you can just activate your 4th ability, leave this field linger, and then you can use a grouping ability to group enemies together, and then you can just like pump them full of an AoE status effect like gas maybe. Which is why we're using the Bubico, which is a very high status applying weapon. And to show off this build really working, so we'll armor strip enemies, and then we'll use Coral Horizon, and then do that. And to note, this is without dexterity procs. So this build does use primary deadhead. This build does use primary deadhead as our base damage, and what you just saw there, me killing those heavy gunners, were without deadhead procced. So if I go and actually proc deadhead, I'll show you what that looks like as well. So this is with all 3 stacks of deadhead ready, so we'll group them together again and do that. Oopsies. And look, they're all dead. So it is a very powerful setup, and the reason being is because so gas is an AoE, obviously, so it's very powerful because all the enemies that are grouped together will each have their own gas clouds, which will each hit all the enemies grouped together, which applies a lot of damage. It's very good. And gas also has a lingering effect as well, so it will remain on the field even after the enemy dies, which will continue to do damage for the remaining duration of the status effect, which again is pretty good. The other thing that's good about gas, and the reason why we use deadhead, is because gas can headshot. I do believe it is the only status effect in the game that can headshot, and its headshot multiplier is only 1, so normally that wouldn't really mean anything, but Deadhead increases your headshot multiplier with the rank 5 extra bonus it has, which does affect gas. So gas will increase the damage it does thanks to the Deadhead headshot multiplier. And that brings us to Coil Horizon. Why Coil Horizon? So I was actually always going to use Coil Horizon because it has a very large range for the Helminth grouping abilities. Its range is 12 meters at base. It is Gyro's Helminth ability. While Lava, as an example, on Nidus has 12 meters, but as a Helminth ability, it's only 8 meters. And Airburst is another one, also only has 8 meters, both on Zephyr and as a Helminth. And then Ensnare, I didn't want to use because I didn't want to have to specifically target an enemy to activate the ability. I want to be able to cast the ability and have them group where I want them to be. A few issues around Coil Horizon is, however, is you cast it once, it summons this ball that will then run around for a duration. And if you have a decent duration on your setup, like I do, it will last for quite a while. So you do really need to cast it a second time in order to trigger the implosion, which will then group enemies together. So I was always going to use Coil Horizon because of its increased range compared to other Helminth grouping, but Coil Horizon actually got an augment with this update. That does some funky stuff. If you're familiar with Gyro's kit, you'll know about the ability Road to Swell, which sends a ring around Gyro, kind of like the ring that you see around Coil Horizon right now. In fact, it looks exactly the same. And enemies that get caught in this ring will receive electricity damage over time. And any enemy and Coil Horizon's new augment, as you just saw, will now apply electric discharges as it runs through enemies. And once you activate its implosion effect, it will send out additional discharges. And you'll see some of these enemies, 13 electricity status effects and furthermore. So normally without this augment, applying these extra discharges, more electricity status effects, and more damage that the ability does, the ability would only apply 1 electric status effect. Now it's applying a lot more. Why is this such a big buff? Because just like gas, electric is a AoE status effect. that will hit all the enemies that are grouped together and increase the damage this setup does. If I activate my armor strip and then use my Coil Horizon, you'll see that the damage Coil Horizon does alone, even without my weapon, is actually pretty good against these enemies. Just from all the electric status effect. And then obviously we can take this setup to the next level by summoning our ranged sentience to summon the extra tower status effects, which will increase the status chance of our weapon. I don't know if that status chance doesn't work for abilities like Core Horizon, unfortunately. But it'll increase the status chance of our weapon, and it will just rip into, oh, I forgot to arm strip. And it will just rip into enemies. Like so. And then obviously we can use our thirst to get our energy back. So now that you understand how this setup actually works, let's actually look at the builds. So let's go into Caliban. So I don't have any Archon shards used for these builds, so you can put on anything you want. But for Caliban, I do have in the aura slot corrosive protection. The reason why I'm doing that is because you'll notice my strength isn't at 200%, and you need 200% strength to fully armor strip enemies with his 4th ability. But with corrosive projection, I can lower that, so now I'm defense stripping by 87%, which is actually just a bit more than I need with corrosive projection. I only need 82% with corrosive projection, but now I can fully strip enemies even without having to mod for power strength or have Archon shards. And then we have overextended and stretch for range. The range will increase the grouping range of Coral Horizon, and it will also increase the range of the field from Caliban's 4th ability. So you definitely want to pump a lot of range on this setup. And then we do have kind of basic duration, as the duration will of course increase the length of the field on the field. It will also increase the length of his 3rd ability. However, the 3rd ability's base duration is actually a lot better than what it was before. I think it was like 25 before seconds, and now it's 45 seconds, so it's almost double what it was before. But on top of prime continuity for duration, we also do have Molt Efficiency, which will give us an additional 36% ability duration as long as our shields are active. And then we do have Umbral Intensify and Blind Range for our ability Strength. We don't really care about the negative efficiency that Blind Range gives us, as we will be getting back all the energy we need from Razor Gyro, and Razor Gyro refunds 25% of the energy we spend on the ability. So actually having this ability cost more energy technically increases the amount of energy we get back from it as well. So it actually works well with that. Arcane Energize though is of course a bit more for our energy economy. Adaptation, the 50% damage reduction you get from Caliban's passive is just not enough. You do want to add adaptation on top of it for the extra damage reduction as well, just to make your survivability a bit better. And then we have Coil Recharge, which is Coil Horizon's new augment. And the last thing that you want to have on the build to make it a complete setup is Prime Sure-Footed. Why? Because Bubico, which is the weapon you'll be using, has a 7 meter AoE, and that AoE will knock you down if you don't have Prime Sure-Footed on the build. Speaking of Bubonico, I've been saying that wrong this entire time probably. This is the Bubonico build. So what is Bubonico all about? How does this weapon work? Let's actually talk about that for a second. So this is an infested weapon from the Biolab in the dojo. Important to note, in December, we will be getting infested liches, meaning we may be getting an upgraded version of this weapon. It'll be interesting to find out. So this weapon has 2 fire modes. It has one fire mode, which is a fast firing shotgun that has a pretty good crit chance, crit damage effect. The alt fire of it will fire out 3 consecutive blasts with a 7 meter AoE with a very high status chance, but a low crit chance, but actually a pretty good crit damage, but the crit chance is very low. This weapon is kind of like the epitaph, I suppose, of primary weapons, as it has a very high status chance. The other buff that this weapon has, however, is the alt fire of the weapon does viral damage. This means that we can have the weapon dealing viral and gas status effects in one, which will be a big buff to our damage output. So obviously we will be using the RachoFire for this build for the AoE, and this is the build here. We obviously have Galvanized Hell for the extra multi-shot, and Galvanized Sati for the status chance and the gun CO effect as well. Shotgun Elementalist obviously for the status damage, which will increase our damage output, and our faction damage. Faction damage is very important as faction damage double dips with status effects, meaning it does a big damage buff, so you definitely need your faction damage on it. Then we have our Toxic Barrage, Scattering Inferno, which is our Toxic and Heat 60/60 mods, giving us our gas damage as well as more status chance. Some more multi-shot, and lastly, I do have status duration. As I said, gas will permeate, it will stay on the field while after enemies die, and the time it stays in the field is the remaining of the status effects duration. So increasing the status duration for gas will mean it lingers on the field for a bit longer. And since the weapon has absolutely abysmal crit chance, it's really not worth modding for crit anyway, so you have a few mod spaces freed up. We do have Deadhead, as I said, it will give us that 360% base damage buff, while also giving us that 30% increased headshot multiplier, which works with gas. So the headshot damage that gas will do will be increased thanks to Deadhead. For the companion with this build, honestly, you have a lot of options. There's no companion that is specifically needed for this build to work. I simply went with my Hound here for some survivability and crowd controlling effect. So obviously you have Guardian, so when our shield breaks, because this is a shield tank setup obviously, when our shields break, it will have a chance to, well not a chance, it will restore 100% of it as long as it's off cooldown. And then we have Repo Audit, which will disarm enemies within 30 meters. That means it's Loki's fourth ability, essentially. And then we have Manifold Bond that will spread the status effects when we activate, and when it activates a preset ability like Repo Audit. So we have Radiation on our companion's weapon, which we do. We have Loki's fourth ability with the Augment. This is why Loki isn't a good Warframe. Synth Deconstruct for extra health orb drop chance. Synthesize, I'm not going to say that word, will just stun enemies with electricity damage and kind of spread that around to give us some additional crowd control for some extra survivability. Invasion Denial is for the Hound's survivability along with Linked Redirection and Linked Vital. Vacuum is obviously a must-have. You can't have Fetch on Hounds. They do take Beast and Robotic mods, but you can't have Fetch. I'm actually unsure. I know either the Vacuum or Fetch, one of them is actually slightly better than the other, but I can't remember which one's which. So Vacuum might be the better one anyway, I'm not sure. And then Momentumous Bond is not only to increase the priming capabilities of the Hound, as it will give us a random status effect for the Hound, which will then Manifold Bond will prime enemies with, but when we kill an Xmas unit, but also when the Hound goes down, killing an Xmas unit will lower its recovery time by 18 seconds, which is another big buff. It will give it some extra survivability. For the weapon on the Hound, run whatever you want. I don't have a proper build set up for it. I simply just have Radiation, Heat, and Viral, which is for priming with Manifold Bond. And then we do have our utility weapons. For your secondary, you can run whatever you want. Just make sure you're running Amalgam Barrel Diffusion for the extra rolling speed. And then I do like to run Paretos as my melee because of this evolution, which gives you increased sprint speed and also slide, and this evolution that gives you increased parkour velocity. And lastly, the focus score, again, very free. You can run whatever you want. If you wanted more power strength, you could, or casting speed, you could do Meta Ray. If you wanted knockback resistance, if you weren't gonna mod on Prime Sure-Footed, I would definitely recommend using Yunaro for the knockback resistance. The armor strip from Yunaro won't do anything because obviously you already have armor strip. Vazarin will give you that extra shield recharge delay and shield regen, and other survivability, which could be very useful. You could also use Vazarin instead of Core Horizon if you wanted as a grouping ability, but Core Horizon will be better because of its new augment. It increases the damage of this build a lot, and it's really crazy. It's really fun to play around with actually. And then Xenoric you can obviously have just for some additional energy economy, which is what I'm using. But you don't have to use Xenoric. Any of these four would work. Naramon is really only for melee builds, which is not, so Naramon doesn't really play. Anyway, that is the whole setup with Caliban's rework. His rework does make him a much better Warframe, but like I said, he still isn't anything super amazing. But the thing that you have to remember about Caliban is he doesn't have any augments. He doesn't have a single augment, even though he's like almost 3 years old now. So once Caliban starts actually getting augments, he could be a very powerful Warframe depending on what those augments do. So this this rework of his definitely puts him in a much better place to go higher up in the ranks once he does get augments. So it'll be very interesting to see how he ends up later on, like years into the future. But right now he's definitely in a much better place. Nothing super amazing, but definitely a much better Warframe and fun to play with. So I do hope you enjoyed this video. And check out some of my other video and content if you do. I will obviously be posting a Nova build very soon, like tomorrow if not today, and also a Koumei build, which is the new Warframe, also very soon. I have a few other build ideas as well related to the updates, so do stick around for all of that. And until next time, bye bye!